Hello HI240. In this video I will go over the first part of chapter 4 and we will talk about one of the most popular sports of the late 19th century and first part of the 20th century, prize fighting or boxing. But before that, a little bit of an overview. Organized sports became an increasingly important part of American life in the decades following the Civil War. Employers found team sports to be useful in controlling worker attitudes and behavior, and politicians and social workers believe organized play a useful tool to help Americanize immigrant children. This is how they were socialized, the newcomers. And religious leaders believed sports properly played would create better Christians, while newspapers used college and professional sports as a means of reaching wider audiences. It was an advertising tool, especially at the collegiate level, to promote the university. And affluent urbanites in need of physical activity were attracted to the new private clubs that offered gymnasiums and swimming pools, as well as to the country clubs that offered golf, tennis, swimming, which women will now be engaging in those activities, as well as equestrian or horse riding activities. Swimming for women really comes into fore in the post-World War II period, but it begins at the end of the 19th century. Between 1860 and 1920, the United States entered a new era that was shaped by investment banks and corporations that capitalized upon a wide range of scientific and technological advances. Driven by heavy immigration from Europe and Asia, the population increased from 31 million to 120 million. It quadrupled. And what are we going to do with all these new people? Far-reaching advances in manufacturing and transportation contributed to the spectacular growth of cities. And by 1920, over half of the American people lived in urban areas. On the farm, innovations in planting and harvesting equipment, as well as advances in crop and animal science, meant that the average farmer produced 15 times the amount of food or fiber in 1920 than his predecessor did 50 years earlier. As people are more able to get around easier, they're more willing to travel places to watch organized sports, and now the lifespan also is going to increase because of better nutrition. This agricultural revolution drove many marginal farmers off the land and into the towns and cities in search of employment. Those who remained on the land were caught up in a new and often baffling economy controlled by central banks, commodities exchanges, foreign competition, and national railroad systems. And as a result, the Federal Reserve Act will be passed in 1913 that will regulate banks. The Securities and Exchange Commission will come in the New Deal era of the 1930s. The tariffs will be lowered in the 1930s. And in the late 19th century, in an attempt to control railroads, the Interstate Commerce Commission will be created in 1887. More on that, ladies and gentlemen, in American Nation 2. By 1920, America had left its agrarian past behind, and it entered a complex modern age. And as a consequence of these far-reaching economic transformation, American sports took on a distinctly new look. And prize fighting will enter the mainstream. And it fell into decline in the years after the Civil War because of Victorian moralists, basically. They were offended by the brutality of the sport and concerned about its apparent encouragement of disorderly behavior, consumption of alcoholic beverages, and gambling. And these stern guardians of public morality demanded enforcement of anti-prize fighting laws. By the 1870s, however, men's athletic clubs began providing instruction in the manly art of self-defense and conducted public exhibitions under the Marquis of Queensberry rules that required padded gloves, limited length of rounds, 10-second knockouts, and a limit on the number of rounds, and the abolition of wrestling, hitting below the belt, holding, and eye gouging. Boxing consequently began a comeback that would lead to its legalization in some states by the 1920s. But in the late 19th century, though, there's still bare-knuckle boxing, as we'll see. And it received a major boost from a young entrepreneur recently arrived from Ireland, who purchased the struggling National Police Gazette in 1877. The brash Richard Kyle Fox increased circulation by featuring stories emphasizing sin and sex, and drawings of sensuous women often appeared on page 1. Printed on pink newsprint, the National Police Gazette became known as the Bible of the Barber Shop. This is one of the original men's magazines, ladies and gentlemen. It was seen everywhere men gathered: in saloons, hotel lobbies, pool halls, tobacco shops, gambling dens, barber shops, and Fox turned the weekly into one of the great financial success stories of the publications industry. The print media is the main media of the late 19th and quite a bit of the 20th century, until radio and television slowly made inroads into that. And in so doing, he set a new low for lewd and the bizarre, never hesitating to exploit racist and nativist themes along with the standard fare of sex and crime. Fox also relentlessly promoted prizefighting. He did so because he enjoyed bedeviling ministers and social reformers, but he recognized that heavy coverage of the manly art increased readership, and in 1880, circulation jumped from 150 to 400,000 when the Gazette provided heavy coverage of the Joe Goss and Paddy Ryan fight. Fox even became a promoter of prize fights, creating 6 weight classifications and providing handsome championship belts for each. He sponsored bouts, negotiated with fighters and their managers, and he challenged anti-boxing laws in the courts. And he imported pugilistic — the pugilist is another name for a boxer — from all over Europe. And his reporters cranked out an endless stream of enthusiastic accounts of major prize fights, accompanied by artist impressions of action in the ring. And his crusade on the behalf of boxing became intricately entwined with the career of the Boston strong boy John L. Sullivan. Throughout the 1880s, Fox carried on a lively feud with the popular heavyweight, belittling his pugilistic ability while futilely promoting one unsuccessful challenger after another who might topple the popular champion. Although Fox feigned personal animosity towards Sullivan, he knew that the public quarrel sold newspapers, and Fox's petulance helped create America's first sports star, John L. Sullivan. Legend has it that the feud began one spring evening in 1881 in Harry Hill's Saloon, a popular New York City watering hole for the sporting crowd. As Fox took his seat, he noticed a boisterous group at a nearby table where the well-known heavy drinker John L. Sullivan was surrounded by an entourage and a cluster of empty whiskey bottles. Fox reportedly said to a waiter, "Tell Sullivan to come over here. I want to talk to him." Well into his cups, Sullivan loudly retorted so everyone in the club could hear, "You tell Fox if he wants to see me, he can, come over to my table." Fox subsequently spent the next decade attempting to teach the ill-mannered Bostonian a lesson by finding someone who could defeat him in the ring. Fox may have been truly offended by Sullivan's boorish behavior, but he also saw in the charismatic Irish brawler an adversary made in heaven. Just a month after the confrontation, he sent reporters to cover a championship fight between Sullivan and a longshoreman by the name of John Flood. And in order to avoid authorities, this fight was held on a barge floating in the Hudson River. The Hudson connects Albany and New York City, ladies and gentlemen. Sullivan easily defeated his opponent, and Fox was soon promoting a new challenger in the person of Paddy Ryan, and he posted a $2,500 purse on Ryan's behalf and then trumpeted the challenger's prowess. No prize fight had previously received such a buildup, as the Gazette featured a steady stream of reports from secret training camps. The fight was scheduled for New Orleans, but was moved to Mississippi City when Louisiana authorities threatened to arrest the participants. Fox prematurely dubbed Ryan Champion of America, but Sullivan easily dispatched his opponent in minutes with his sledgehammer smashes. Such excellent description. The best Fox writers could report that Ryan had demonstrated vigor and gameness, but Sullivan knocked Ryan senseless in round 9. "When Sullivan struck me," a woeful Paddy said later, "I thought a telephone pole had shoved me endways." Disappointed perhaps, but undaunted, Fox recognized that the man he despised was nonetheless his meal ticket and put up a $5,000 for a rematch, which produced a similar result. Fox had commissioned a glittering diamond-studded championship belt for the winner, but Sullivan dismissed it as a dog collar and set out on an 8-month carnival tour where he fought any local challenger willing to take his chances for a $1,000 prize if he lasted 4 rounds against the champion. Few did. Determined to unseat the great John L., Fox came up with yet another challenger. Jake Kilrain had defeated several prominent fighters, and he seemed to be Fox's man. When Sullivan refused to agree to a match, Fox proclaimed that Sullivan had forfeited his crown and that Kilrain was the new champion. Sullivan left for a 6-month exhibition tour of Europe, and upon his return went on a prolonged drinking and eating binge that saw him balloon to 240 pounds, and his health deteriorated, and the Gazette reported that Sullivan was at death's doors, while simultaneously goading him with barbs that he was using his illness to avoid Kilrain. Finally, he agreed to a fight. And the reporters said that he was in poor condition, and they promoted Kilrain's strength and endurance. The nation's attention was glued to the upcoming confrontation as the melodrama unfolded in comic proportion. Louisiana authorities proclaimed their intention to arrest and prosecute the fighters and promoters, and so did the state police of those 4 other states. And for 2 months, they still sold tickets, even though they did not know where the fight was going to be held. And on July 7th, 1889, the day before the fight, Mississippi sawmill operator Charles Rich had a crew assemble a makeshift wooden grandstand of newly cut pine on a clearing in his heavily wooded 30,000-acre spread near the town of Richburg. And then promoters had 3 chartered trains at the ready, and when they gave word, the ticket holders piled aboard and they headed for that town. The original plan was for the showdown to occur shortly after dawn in order to avoid the heat, but it was delayed because the arriving fans had to take their places on the boards that were now oozing pitch in the hot sun. And by fight time, the temperature had reached 100 degrees. And a future mayor of New Orleans, John Fitzpatrick, served as a referee, and at 10:13 a.m. he drew a line in the dirt and he called the fighters to scratch. What would be the last bare-knuckle championship fight thus commenced. It proved an epic struggle. Within the first 15 seconds, Kilrain tossed Sullivan to the ground, and it became evident that his strategy was to take advantage of the perception that Sullivan had not recovered from his illness. He attempted to wear him down under the hot sun that poured down on the makeshift ring. Round 4 lasted 15 minutes, and it revealed that it was Kilrain who was not in the best of condition as he absorbed a barrage of powerful blows. He persevered as the rounds went by, absorbing a terrific pounding, but somehow managed to prevent Sullivan from landing a knockout blow. By round 30, Kilrain had to be carried back to his corner after each round and pushed out to the scratch line when Fitzpatrick shouted time. During the 30-second intervals between rounds, Sullivan gulped down copious amounts of whiskey, which apparently produced a violent vomiting spell in the midst of round 44. By round 60, Sullivan's eyes were nearly swollen shut, but an exhausted Kilrain could barely stand. Both men were bloodied, their ribs red and swollen, and their faces splotched with ugly bruises, and their skins bright red from the blistering sun. Finally, the carnage ended in round 75, as Sullivan pounded a defenseless Kilrain, whose manager tossed a sponge into the ring, signaling concession. The brutal contest had lasted 2 hours and 16 minutes. Controversy surrounding this historic match would remain in the newspapers for more than a year. Both fighters got arrested on the East Coast and were extradited to Mississippi to stand trial. Separate trials were held in the small town of Purvis. They led to convictions, substantial fines, and jail sentences, 1 year for Sullivan, 2 months for Kilrain. But the Mississippi justice system proved lenient. For one thing, several of the jurors had attended the fight, and public sentiment supported the 2 fighters, and the judge seemed to be starstruck in the presence of the famous John L. Convoluted legal reasoning from the bench made a mockery of Mississippi's anti-prize-fighting statute, and upon appeal, both defendants avoided jail time. The epic battle became an instant legend that grew larger with the passage of time. It proved the last bare-knuckle championship fight. A new age of scientific boxing was at hand with all those rules that we previously discussed, the Marquis of Queensberry rules. After escaping the clutches of the Mississippi legal system, John L. lost interest in fighting and did not defend his crown for 3 years. He spent time on the vaudeville stage. He toured the United States and Australia as the male lead in the melodrama Honest Hearts and Willing Hands, and he flirted with the idea of running for Congress. He also continued his lifelong love affair with alcohol, and his weight bludgeoned and bloomed again up to 250, and in 1892, at the age of 34, faced with financial problems, he returned to the ring once more to defend his crown for a big payday. He did so in typical flamboyant style by issuing a national challenge to anyone, excluding African Americans. He was quick to make clear, willing to put up a $10,000 side bet and fight for a winner-takes-all purse of $50,000 offered by New Orleans promoters eager to take advantage of a new city ordinance permitting boxing under the Marquis of Queensberry rules. Sullivan's last title defense ended one era and began another. It was fought under the bright electric lights in a public arena before an audience of 10,000 of New Orleans' leading citizens. It was the first gloved championship bout, and the man who challenged Sullivan was a young San Franciscan gentleman, Jim Corbett, who had defeated Jake Kilrain in 1890. But before that, this is John L. fighting Jake Kilrain. That is John L. Sullivan on the left. The last bare-knuckle championship. Sullivan trained sporadically for the bout, and he continued his drinking. Meanwhile, Corbett reduced his smoking to just 2 cigars a day while getting himself into fighting trim. Following months of pre-fight hype, the actual bout proved to be anticlimactic as the 26-year-old Corbett systematically bludgeoned the aging champion. In round 3, he broke Sullivan's nose, and by round 10, Sullivan was barely able to defend himself. Finally, in round 20, Gentleman Jim decided it was time to end the contest, and he caught John L. with a vicious right cross. Sullivan collapsed to the canvas like an ox. The next day, Sullivan met the press suffering from a broken nose, a closed eye, badly swollen lips, and a tongue that was also swollen. His black and blue face was laced with ugly stitches. He also was suffering from a hangover after a long night of drinking to console himself on the loss of his crown. Prize fighting had entered a new era. The defeat ended Sullivan's professional boxing career, and he headed back to the vaudeville stage. The most popular sports star of the 19th century, Sullivan remained a national figure until felled by a heart attack in 1918. His boxing career spanned 2 distinct epochs, the bare-knuckle era and the new Marquis of Queensberry rules era. The ability of the media to create sports stars had been demonstrated by Richard Kyle Fox, and when Fox died in 1922, the New York Times identified him as a patron of sports, although acknowledging he knew nothing of any game or sport except boxing.